Morning. Today is June 26, 2019, and my name is Hal Harden, and today I have the distinct pleasure of taking the oral history of Judge Gilbert S. Merritt. Judge Merritt, good morning, and thank you for coming in and sharing some memories with us. We are very appreciative of that. Now, I know you came from a long line of distinguished ancestors. Maybe you could summarize and tell us who they were. And the first one that came here was on the first boat, was he not?
On the first boat, yeah, well, that's right. The Donaldson family came down on the boat, or John Donaldson Sr. came down on the boat, bringing the children and the families, and his oldest son and the males came across through the Cumberland Gap and on down into Middle Tennessee. And they got here, that is the men, not John Donaldson, who was coming with the families by boat, but they got here on New Year's 1780. And the Cumberland River was frozen over at that time. So they walked across the river, and in April of that same year, the John Donaldson Sr. with the women and the children who had come down and come, I guess, down the Tennessee River and then on up the Cumberland arrived.
Why do you think they picked Nashville?
Well, there's a long story behind it. I've kind of forgotten the story, but it was purchased. There was a guy who, they weren't going to Kentucky to begin with, but something happened, and they bought the rights to a lot of land around Middle Tennessee, and there were quite a few people. You know, there were stations out in the different, on the river really, because that was the only means of transportation at that time. But there was a financial deal that was made of some kind, and I can't remember the details of it, but anyway, that's why they got here.
Well, tell us about some of your other ancestors.
Well,
You have the Logues and the Cantrells and...
Right, I've got a lot of relatives who moved here early. The Merritts came about 1815, and the first one of them married, what was her name? Anyway, he married Sally Raines, that was her name, and she was the youngest of the old Colonel Raines' children. So the Merritts came down about 1815, I think it was, long in there. And then my grandparents' family, the Johnsons, my grandmother on my mother's side, she was some kin to old Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president. He was not the most, he doesn't have too good a reputation, you know. He's the one
impeached.
who got impeached. But he wasn't convicted, but anyway, there were quite a few who came down around the same time.
Well, what kind of business were the Logues in and the Cantrells?
You know, everybody back then was in the farming business in one way or another. My grandfather, Cantrell, started this business in about when he was a very young man, 1912 or something like that, and it was called Southern Woodenware Company, and it was in the wholesale business, hardware, etc. And after my mother and my father got married, my father went into that business when he was a young man, and then he ran that business for some years and did quite well with that business. But I don't know, everybody on particularly my father's side, were land poor in the sense that they had more land than they had money, and did a lot of farming and the dairy business, owned a lot of land around, all through Donaldson and in between Nashville and Donaldson. So that's what they did for a living. But then in that era, you know, some high percentage, 80–90% of the people were engaged in some form of farming and agricultural pursuits.
Any of your family involved in the Civil War?
Yeah, oh yeah. My, let's see, great-grandfather, I guess it was, he joined the 1st Infantry of Tennessee as soon as he could, and he fought for 4.5 years and never got all over the place.
Was he at Fort Donelson by any chance?
Huh?
Did he fight at Fort
He
Donelson?
may have, but I'm not sure. I don't know all the places he was, but I know that he was in the Confederate Army for 4 or 5 years, 4 years, and fought in different places, and he may very well have been there. I don't know that I've ever known the answer to that question.
And you mentioned your father had this building, I believe it's on 2nd Avenue, Southern Woodenware.
Woodenware Company.
What building is that now? What's it called now? It's a nightclub, isn't it?
Well, back there was one. The first one he had was 166 2nd Avenue North, which was a smaller warehouse. And then he needed more room, more space, because he had a lot of different products, and he bought a much larger building up 2nd Avenue of, I don't know, 10 or so buildings. And I can remember as a child growing up that I moved along with a helper. My father wanted me to move a lot of the inventory that was down in the smaller building up to the bigger building, and we moved it right up 2nd Avenue on the sidewalk, and took practically all summer long. It was a big chore, and also I had to, the basement was dirt, so it needed to be covered over with concrete. Anyway, I remember going home and my mother saying to my father, "Gilbert, you're gonna kill this boy. You're working him to death." But I was young, I don't know, 13, 14, 15, something, when he was doing that, and I guess it was good for me.
Do you know which nightclub is in that building now?
No,
Okay.
I don't know.
But it's still standing?
Yeah.
Okay, now, you were also related to a chancellor here in Nashville, isn't that correct? Did you have a
Chancellor
ancestor?
Merritt, yeah. He was the one in the Civil War, and then when he got out, he ran for, he was in the state senate, I know, and then after he was in the state senate, he ran for judge, and he was the chancellor of Davidson and, as I remember, Williamson County together, the Floterial District. for the chancellor, and he remained as chancellor for some years.
And where is he buried?
He's buried out in Mount Olivet.
Okay. All of your family's buried out there, is that
Mount
correct?
Olivet, yeah.
Now, are you related to Rachel Jackson, President Jackson's?
Yes. John Donaldson came down here. Rachel was his daughter, and she married Andrew Jackson, as you know. So John Donaldson, who was my ancestor going on back, as I mentioned before, had a number of children. I've forgotten how many, 7 or 8 children, one of whom was Rachel. And his oldest son was my ancestor, was in my direct line. And his sister Rachel married Andrew Jackson.
Do you have any memorabilia from any of these ancestors, such as pieces of furniture or chests or guns?
I've got some letters.
Letters. No, that's invaluable.
But I can't remember any particular memorabilia, no.
Well, during that era of Jackson and the Donaldsons had a beautiful mansion out in the Hermitage area also. Isn't that right? I think it's across from Andrew Jackson Grammar School. There was a Donaldson mansion there, supposedly.
I don't think so.
No?
The Tulip Grove was across the street.
Right.
In Buttons there, and Tulip Grove is still, that house is still there. Now, I grew up in a house, but it was purchased in about 1948 or so, Oakwood Farm. And it was kind of a next door to, in a way, the Hermitage property there. So I always think of myself as having really grown up on the farm next door to the Hermitage.
Do you remember Andrew Jackson Jr.'s homestead called Birdsong? It was.
You mean?
He had a place, a farm, a home called Birdsong, which was.
No, I don't. Not right off.
Okay. Now, you say you mentioned your father. Now, he went to Vanderbilt Law School at one time, did he
Yeah,
not?
right.
Did he graduate?
Yeah.
And did he ever practice?
No, I think he got out of law school about the time of the Depression, and there weren't many lawyers getting jobs, and about the same time, he married my mother, and my mother's father, Dempsey Cancel, had this business, so my grandfather invited my father to come into the business with him, and that's what happened.
Well, now you, as I recall, went to school here in Davidson County. You went to Donaldson Elementary, and then you went on to Yale and or Castle Heights at that,
Yeah.
which was a military school at that time up
It's
in
out of
Lebanon.
business now, but it was doing quite well back then after the Second World War.
And some of the buildings are still standing, I
Yeah.
noticed, up in Lebanon.
Right, they are.
And then you went on to Harvard and Yale.
I went to Vanderbilt Law School. I went to Yale undergraduate school and graduated in 1957, and then the next year, I started at Harvard Law School, but I had also applied to Vanderbilt Law School, and for a whole combination of reasons, I decided that I didn't like Harvard Law School very well. Back, several things happened. It got this was before Thanksgiving in Cambridge, it got kind of cold, and I had gone out and bought myself a coat, an overcoat with a velvet collar on it. And went to the breakfast over at the Commons there for the law school. And when I got out, somebody had stolen my coat. And not long after that, we were assigned some reserve readings to do, and had to get the reserve books were on the list on reserve on the bench, and I went to get the book that I was supposed to read on reserve, and somebody before me had torn the pages out of the book. So I got started thinking, maybe I ought to go to Vanderbilt. So I called Dean Wade on the telephone. He was John Wade, who was a wonderful scholar as well as a dean, and had rebuilt the Vanderbilt Law School after the Second World War. And I told him I'd like to come to Vanderbilt, and I would like to come as soon as he could allow me to come. And he said, well, I've never had a request like this before. I'll have to take it up. And he had a small group of the faculty he took it up with, and then he called me back and said, well, they've decided it's okay, so you can come on. I came to Vanderbilt to law school, graduated from Vanderbilt Law School.
What year was that?
It's 1960.
Who was in your class of note?
Well, Harold Bingham. I don't know whether you ever knew Harold Bingham
He
or not.
taught me at Vanderbilt. He was one of my teachers.
He and I were in the same class. He was first in the class. I was second in the class, academically. And then he became a law professor, didn't he?
Yes.
And he's a good man. Who else? I don't know.
Now Jim Neal and Bill Willis. And
they had, Jim Neal had graduated a year or two before I graduated. And I think Willis had graduated a year or two before. I can't remember whether they were in the same class, but they were ahead of me anyway.
I don't believe the word, but Neal was in the famous class of '57, which held themselves out as being the best class ever to graduate from Vanderbilt. Jim Henry was in that class.
That's right, he was.
And several other, George Merritt, I believe.
It was a good class.
It was a good. I believe Willis was a couple of years before that. I'm not sure. Well, which persons would you say were important to you in your formative years, coming up through school?
Well, outside my family,
Of course.
I would say my mentor was John Wade, the dean of the Vanderbilt Law School. He asked me to come on the faculty as kind of the janitor of the faculty when I graduated, which I did, and then the year after that, as I remember, I went to Harvard Law School to get a master's degree because I was kind of thinking about teaching law. But then I decided that although I did teach law at one sort of class or subject at a time as an adjunct professor, I decided I'd practice law. So I would say John Wade was a great mentor of mine.
And in law school, who were some of your close friends?
I've lost touch with a lot of people that I was in law school with. Ed Blank, but he was behind me. I'll have to think about that a bit.
And Ed, of course, became a great trial lawyer here in Nashville.
He was a little behind me, though, I think.
Well, you first of all, well, tell us where you first went to practice law. What office?
Well, after I got out of Harvard Law School to get a master's degree in law, I came back to Nashville and went to work with Boult, Hunt, Cummings, and Connors. Reaper Boult, John Connors. It was a very, very good firm. I was number 7 lawyers, 6th or 7th lawyer, and that time the Boult firm was on the 7th floor, and I was either the 6th or the 7th lawyer in the firm. Bassbury and Sims was on 10. Waller was on 12. Manier, Crouch, and White was on 4. So the old Nashville Trust Building had a lot of the good law firms were in the same building.
Excellent law firms, the cream of the crop. And did you start trying cases, or what was your
Well,
what
the
your
first
practice?
thing that happened was that, yes, that firm represented a lot of insurance companies, and I was the dean of the fender bender. I didn't begin to try personal injury cases until some later, but I tried. I remember when I got there, they put a stack of files on my desk about a foot and a half, 2 feet high, and I started trying cases. And back at that time, there was no discovery. You had to go out and get the statements from the witnesses and all. So for the first year or so, I basically tried all these cases, and also was involved with, helped Edwin Hunt, who was Boult, Hunt, Cummings, and Connors, who was engaged in the process of bringing Metro government to try to get it installed. And during the year I came back, we had the vote. It had failed, Metro government failed in 1958, but then in 60, when I got back in 1961, 62, it was adopted. And so I helped Mr. Hunt, who proceeded to have a heart attack. And so I started, when I helped him, Beverly Briley, who was then, after it went into effect, I think it was April 1, 1963, Beverly Briley was the Metropolitan Mayor, and he asked me, because he knew I had done a lot of work on the Metro government with Mr. Hunt, who had this heart attack, he asked me to come over and be the first lawyer for the Metropolitan government when it went into effect. And so I proceeded to do that, and it was a real learning experience, because we had to put together the old city and the old county, all of the different bureaus, school boards, and everything.
Well, how old were you?
Well, 1963, born 1936, so
Quite young.
yeah,
Well,
in my 20s.
so you held that position for how long?
I was the lawyer for Metro for several years.
And you left and went where?
When I left the Metropolitan government, I went to, became United States District Attorney, as I remember. Is that right? I think that's right.
And then after you were U.S. Attorney, you went with Gullet Sanford, is that right?
Yeah, Gilbert, Steele, Sanford, Robinson, and Merritt.
Well, tell us a story about how you became the U.S. Attorney for the Middle District of Tennessee.
Well, in 1964, in 1964, I helped Ross Bass, who was a congressman from Tennessee, run for the Senate, and he was elected. He ran against Governor Frank Clement and was elected to the Senate. And so that was back in the days when Tennessee was a Democratic state, and the other senator from Tennessee was Albert Gore. And I had known the Gore family for some years, mainly because when I was at Castle Heights, Nancy Gore, she was a couple of years younger than I, and we had gone out and together and dated to some extent, and so the question came up. Willis, Bill Willis, Jim Neal, was the United States Attorney at that time, and he decided that he wanted to leave and go into the practice of law. And the question came up who was going to be the United States Attorney, and kind of in terms of seniority, Bill Willis would have been ahead of me, but he decided that he didn't want to do that, and so at that time, the local powers that be in the Democratic Party, in addition to the elected officials, were John Siegenthaler, who had come back as the editor of the Nashville Tennessean, and so the Tennessean was for me. And then I called Senator Gore on the phone because, of course, he was a senior senator and he had more to do with it than anybody did, naming who the United States Attorney was going to be. So I called him on the phone and asked if I could meet with him, and he said he was in Washington, but he said that he was coming back that weekend. We would meet, if I would meet him at I think it was the old James Robertson Hotel where he had a suite or something. And he told me that he was a little reluctant because he would be responsible if I did something wrong as United States Attorney. And he was looking for someone with a little gray in his hair, and I was very young, 28 or 29 or something. And he said, I remember him saying, I would like to get somebody with a little gray in his hair, in his head, like Jared Maddox, who was the lieutenant governor in Tennessee at that time from Cookeville. And he went home, I remember, because his daughter Nancy, who was a good friend, told me that he came home that evening for dinner, and he said to his wife, Pauline Gore, who, by the way, was the first woman, I believe she was the first woman to graduate from Vanderbilt Law School. She was a lawyer, right. A very able woman. And he said, well, you'll never guess who I talked to today. He called me Buddy Merritt, and he wants to be the United States Attorney, but I told him that he was too young and that I wanted somebody who was older. And he said, I don't know that he knows much about that. And Mrs. Gore, Pauline Gore, said, well, Albert, when you were 29, I think that was the age I was, when you were 29, what were you doing? And he thought for a minute and he said, well, I'll tell you, you remember I was elected to the head of the school system in Smith County. And she said, Albert, I think he knows as much about being United States Attorney as you knew about being the head of the school system in Smith County. And anyway, Nancy said that Daddy laughed, and from that point on, I got appointed as United States District Attorney, and I served for 3.5 years, I guess it was.
Well, I want to ask you some questions about your tenure there, but I'm curious, why did Bill Willis turn down the opportunity?
He was practicing law with John Jay and Henry Hooker, and they had a big law practice, and they didn't want him to leave. That's my memory, but I may be wrong about that. But anyway, he was older than I, and in sort of the pecking order, he had first come on the job if that's what he wanted, but he decided he didn't want to do that.
Well, just for the younger members of our audience, Jim Neal was the U.S. attorney who had been appointed by Jack Kennedy and was a Watergate prosecutor, as I recall. Is that correct?
Yeah, he did. He was the Watergate prosecutor after that, as I remember, after he left, of course, as United States Attorney. I don't know exactly when he went up, but I can remember. Anyway, I had some conversations with him about going up as the Watergate prosecutor.
Did Mr. Neal give you any advice on being the United States Attorney?
Yeah, he was my predecessor, and I had never tried a criminal case. I didn't know anything about criminal law at the time, or I maybe knew a little about it, but I had not. All the cases I had tried were civil cases. So I remember he gave me a good bit of advice about trying criminal cases, and I learned how to do that.
Well, so when you were United States Attorney, you actually went into the courtroom.
Oh, yeah, a lot. Of course, at that time, the United States Attorney's offices were much smaller. When I went in as United States Attorney, I had 3 or 4 assistants, and I got another one during the period I was there, the 3.5 years I was there.
Who were the main assistants in your office?
Carlton Petway, I don't know whether you remember Carlton. He was an African American.
Great lawyer.
I hired the first African American lawyer. There hadn't, in the South at that time, there hadn't been many African American lawyers hired in the United States Attorney's offices. So I wanted to get a African American lawyer as an assistant. I hired him at Carlton. And then I hired Sissy Daughtry. Sissy had graduated from Vanderbilt Law School and was, I don't know, second or something in the class. And I got a call from John Siegenthaler one day, and he said, and her husband worked at the Tennessean, Larry Daughtry.
Political writer.
Yeah, political writer. And he said, Sissy can't even get an interview with a law firm in Nashville. And he said, do you know any way you can help her a little bit to get an interview? And I said, I've got a vacancy that they've just given me in the Department of Justice. I guess it was a new position. And I said, I would like to hire Sissy, but let me talk to her first and see what. And I did, and she came over, and we talked for a while. She's obviously a very bright woman. She was on the Supreme Court of Tennessee, and then she's on our court now, Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals as a senior judge. So I hired Sissy as a young lawyer and assistant United States attorney. But we had a big time. We had a good staff, and not all of them. I had one who was not too good. I'd kind of inherited from, I had hired because Ross Bass called me on the phone, wanted me to hire Robert E. Lee, and I said, Ross, I looked at he's applied, looked at his application. I don't think he's going to be too good, but Ross was insistent, so, he had appointed, basically, he and Gord appointed me as a United States attorney, so I hired him, but I had to have somebody work with him all the time.
Well, again, by way of background, Carlton Petway, he also had been, or became, he was an assistant public defender, and he was also a prosecuting attorney, as was Sissy Daughtry, in District Attorney Tom Shriver's office.
That's right, yeah.
And a lot of people thought, me included, that Carlton Petway would soon be a governor or something. He was destined, a man of destiny, and unfortunately he died at a very, very
Early,
young
yeah.
age, and it was a great loss to the state
Yeah.
and to our bar.
You got a good memory, but to remember all that.
Well, was Al Knight in your office?
He was kind of my first assistant as United States attorney, and a terrific lawyer.
A lot of people say that Al Knight was maybe the best legal writer that we've ever had in Nashville. He wrote several books and won several awards.
Yes.
Did he write a lot of your briefs while you were U.S. attorney?
Yeah, he wrote some, I know, and we worked together on certain cases, and then he handled others. We separated on others, but he was a very good writer.
Excellent.
And he was a year behind me in law school at Vanderbilt Law School, and he won the writing award for his class, I remember, in Vanderbilt Law School. So he was a very good writer and a very able thinker, good man.
All around good fellow.
Yeah.
Do you remember the first criminal case you tried?
Yeah, I think I remember the first. It was a big case, and I think Neil told me, I don't think you want to try this case because it was a jury hung to begin with, but it was a Donahoe case, I think. And Mr. Hooker Sr. was representing, as I remember, who was kind of the dean of the defense trial lawyers and a wonderful trial lawyer, defended Donahoe. And it was mainly a kind of a tax situation where Donahoe was collecting bribes from different places, Printer's Alley, different law violators. And I remember it had been tried as a not a specific item where you proved each individual bribe and the failure to report it, but where they tried to show, where the government tried to show that he had taken in so much money, and there's a name for that I can't remember now. But anyway, it's not
Hobbs Act?
What?
Hobbs Act?
No. You were trying to show that somebody's lifestyle was such, spending was such, that they had a lot more money, and it has a name, that kind of, anyway, it was tried that way, and they got a hung jury. But I remember after Neil said, you know, you may not want to try that case because we got a hung jury in the case. I looked at it and I thought, well, it's kind of a challenge, I guess. And I decided I'd go ahead and try it, but I would prove each individual bribe and that he hadn't reported it. So we got a conviction. And I was pretty young, 29 years old at that time, and there was a question. My office, back at that time, the United States Attorney's Office was closely covered by both newspapers, and I remember the Tennessean was, Nellie Kenyon was the reporter who covered my office, and there was one, I can't remember his name, from the Banner as well, but she was the main person who covered my office. And she had written some column about, some question about young Merritt and whether he can do what he should be able to do as United States Attorney. And so once I won the Donahoe case, everybody said, well, he must know what he's doing. And I sort of made my day and made it a lot easier because I was no longer thought to be perhaps inept as in too young to hold a job.
Did you have an assistant helping you on that case?
Donahoe? I don't remember that I did, but I could have. I might have. I don't know.
Did you also argue cases in the Sixth Circuit?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't remember how many, but 5 or 6, yeah.
Who were the judges, the federal judges at that time, the trial level?
Frank Gray, Judge Gray was, and Judge Miller. And then I think at some point Judge Miller got appointed to the Court of Appeals. But they were the 2 federal district judges who, as United States attorneys, I remember, I appeared before. And of course, back at that time, we had a docket down in Columbia, which was mainly a moonshine liquor docket. We had lots of moonshine cases down there. And it was a lawyer who was great at defending moonshiners, was his name. He could have tears come down his cheeks defending, was his name. He was from Columbia. Anyway, so I tried a bunch of the old moonshine cases down there in Columbia. I tried lots of different, I would try 5 or 6, 7 cases a year probably.
What other type cases did you try criminally or civilly? You have bank robberies?
Oh yeah, lots of bank robberies.
Were you the U.S. attorney during the Statesville bank robbery gang by any chance?
Well, there was a gang, Gary Lee Etheridge, and he had a female wife, kind of like Bonnie and Clyde, and they were robbing banks right and left. The FBI was having a hard time, and anyway, we finally brought a case against the Etheridge gang, and they had either robbed or burglarized, I don't know how many banks, and we put them all together in one big case and tried the Etheridge gang, and somehow in that case, one of the witnesses, they killed one of the witnesses.
Kingfish wasn't his name?
Kingfish Ferguson.
Yeah.
That's right.
Oh.
And then they buried him, or what they did was they shot him, and whoever it was, I can't remember the guy's name, one of the henchmen for Etheridge, the Etheridge gang, got out with a shovel to dig his grave, because it was down in a little dry creek bed, I remember.
Smith Fork Creek.
Yeah, and so, anyway, Kingfish got, once the guy went up to dig his grave, this has been a long time ago, Kingfish got out of the car, was able to walk up to the first house, and the owner of the house, as I remember, came to the door and looked through a little glass and saw the blood, and the owner came around, and by the time he got around to the front door stoop of his house, Kingfish Ferguson looked up and said, "Look what they've done to me because I know too much about some bank robbing," and died. And of course, that was technically hearsay, but it was a dying declaration. Anyway, there was a big thing about whether that could come into evidence against the Etheridge gang or not. And I tried that case for a month or so because of so many bank robberies and that kind of thing.
Well, that case, I believe, is still a precedent for dying declarations.
Maybe.
Yeah, it was quite a case. And Agent Hank Hillen was on that case, was he not?
Yeah, Hillen was, we had, the FBI was, members of the FBI, John Rogers, I believe his name was, and they were really quite good. The FBI was really, I had a lot of confidence in the FBI. And I think they've, despite my age, got where they were, had confidence that I was representing the government okay.
Well, when you were United States Attorney, did you have much contact with Department of Justice in Washington?
Yeah, I had a good bit. I think at least part of the time, the Attorney General was Ramsey Clark, and someone else too. But they knew or learned that I was of a liberal persuasion, and so if they had some kind of case that they wanted to bring that was liberal in its, that might have been difficult. I remember a couple of times I would get a call to ask me if I could find a case or come up with a case that would, and I've forgotten the different subjects, but anyway, I remember bringing a case or two or three that the Department of Justice wanted to experiment with, see if it could get and it was, I can't remember whether they were criminal or civil. I think they were civil cases they wanted to bring.
What percentage would you guess that your criminal practice was, the U.S. Attorney's Office, versus the civil?
It was more criminal than civil. We had civil cases. We had quite a few civil cases that were eminent domain cases because the lakes were being, but there was a system of dealing with that wasn't, and so I didn't deal with that much. Occasionally, kind of oversaw it, but.
Well, and how often would your grand jury meet back in those days?
We met once a month, once every 2 months, and 23 members of the grand jury. And, I would usually handle the grand jury, or some of my assistants would handle the grand jury, but I was in the grand jury most of the time. or certainly for any major cases.
Back then, in that day, did the Department of Justice come in and inspect your office at all? They do that routinely now. That's the reason for the question.
No, I don't remember coming in. I remember they did send me a lawyer from Washington on a particular set of cases. And I know he became a law professor at UT. What was his name? But no, not generally.
And you remember your salary at that time?
When I went over there, I think it was about $15,000 a year. It went up to 20 or something. Finally, maybe 25, something like that.
Right. And your assistants substantially less than that.
Yeah, I can't remember what their salaries, but they would have been less. Yeah, certainly.
Do you recall if you had to periodically rate the assistants? In other words, turn in a summary of their experience or how they're doing in the office or anything like that?
We may have. I don't remember the Department of Justice wanting me to rate my assistants, because I had them, all the way from Al Knight, who was great, to Robert E. Lee, who wasn't too good. I don't remember rating them. I do remember that after Nixon was elected in, what year was it? 68, I guess it was. He appointed Mitchell as the Attorney General, and Mitchell had been a lawyer who, I didn't think he was much lawyer. And he wrote us all a letter and said we had to keep up with our hours. U.S. Attorney and Assistant United States Attorneys had to keep up with their hours and turn all that in. And I remember thinking he was crazy. But, why would waste more time doing that than, so I remember writing him a letter and saying I would like to be excused from that because it's not something that we need to be doing. And my people working in my office got more important things to do. I never heard from him about it. And then, not too long after that, I resigned and went back into, left the United States Attorney's Office.
You were appointed by Lyndon Johnson, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, and your secretary, was that Kay Rasmussen?
I think so, yeah. She had been there for Neil, too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And stayed there many, many years. Quite a lady.
Was she there when you were U.S.
Yes.
Attorney? She was?
Yeah.
She was good. She was a good secretary.
Well, tell us some of the most memorable trial lawyers, defense attorneys at that time.
Well, Mr. Hooker Sr., I would say, was, although he was a heavy drinker, he was kind of the dean of the old man of the trial bar, and he was a good trial lawyer. And Jack Norman was the other one. And Jack Norman didn't like coming to federal court. He didn't like federal court much, but he came occasionally. And so he would, who else was, I'm having a hard time remembering, other than Mr. Norman and Mr. Hooker. And, we had a problem there with Tommy Osborne, got in all kind of trouble defending Jimmy Hoffa.
As you know now, pursuant to Brady versus Maryland, the government supposedly has to turn over exculpatory evidence. Was there a discovery process when you were at the U.S. Attorney's Office? Or did they have the problems then that it's had now?
As I remember, we had motions, to turn stuff over. I mean, we turned over what.
Yeah. Did you have kind of an open file policy?
I didn't have an open file policy, but we turned things over that I can't really remember exactly what the law was. I guess Brady may have been decided after I was United States Attorney, I don't know. But anyway, I was conscious of the fact that we needed to turn information over if it was of significance for the defense.
From your vantage point as a judge, how do you see the Office of the United States Attorney changing or has changed since the time you were the United States Attorney?
Well, I see the United States attorneys, and particularly the assistant United States attorneys, coming before me as a judge very frequently. And of course, now we have the public defenders. We didn't have public defenders back then. When I was United States Attorney, the court would appoint someone to defend in the case, and by and large, there weren't so many cases that needed public defenders to be appointed, but there were some. I remember several cases where somebody was appointed from the bar.
Mm-hmm. And you didn't have the Speedy Trial Act back then.
I don't believe so. I don't believe we did that.
Did the judges push trials, or were they pretty lenient with continuances, or was Miller different than Judge Gray?
I think Gray and Miller both want to get the cases tried as quickly as they could. Maybe Gray a little more quickly.
And looking back, do you think that your experience as United States Attorney helped you when you became a judge?
Oh yeah, no doubt of that.
In what way, may I ask?
Well, it's helpful for judges to understand the problems that lawyers have, and to have participated in the process of trying cases. I think to some extent, we've gotten away a little bit from appointing judges who have been active in the practice of law. And I think most lawyers would say that having had an extensive practice of both handling cases at the trial level and at the appellate level is very helpful for a judge.
Now, when you were U.S. Attorney, it was common for the United States Attorney to appear before the Sixth Circuit, isn't that right? And argue cases?
I argued a number of cases in the Sixth Circuit. I've forgotten how many, but I usually had 2 or 3 a year or something. I enjoyed the arguments in the Court of Appeals.
Do you see many United States attorneys now arguing before the court?
Not many. The United States Attorney's Office, it seems to me, has become more a management situation and less involved in the actual trial practice of law. That is, the United States attorneys, they've got more assistants now, and they sort of manage the office as an executive, but they don't do much in the way of actually practicing law. That's in general. Now, there are, I'm sure, plenty of exceptions to that.
Are you glad you came along when you did?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, it was a lot more fun trying cases.
And looking back over it, is there anything that you would change, or would you do it all over again the way you've done it, the way you've handled your career and your profession?
Well, after I was United States Attorney and Nixon was elected, and so I went out with the United States attorneys back then, and still I think today come and go as, maybe not as much, but pretty much come and go as the office of the president changes. Your question was,
Would you do it all over again the way you did it? Or you I think there's some ways you would change, or?
well, I think I would continue to be a trial lawyer and to try cases if I could. Now, it may be that the pressures of being United States Attorney with a big office of, I don't know how many lawyers they've got in Nashville now in the United States Attorney's Office, but I expect it's 30 or 40 or something. And, you know, I had 5 or 6. So the management problem is greater, there's no doubt of that. But to the extent possible, I remember appointing Ronnie Woodall, 1 or 2 of my assistants, to take care of a lot of the executive management problems in the office so I could try the cases. I kind of enjoyed that, and I think that would, of course, I was younger at that time than most of these. The United States attorneys are now. They're older, and they tend to be executives over the office. But I think if I could, I would continue to want to try cases.
Well, now you see more and more career prosecutors, but back in your day, is that a common thing that assistants wanted to make a career out of prosecution, or was it just a step in their legal experience?
It was mainly a step. They would, you know, go back into private practice and as defense lawyers or whatever. Yeah, I would say people didn't think about making a career out of being an assistant United States attorney or that kind of thing.
Do you have any projects that you have yet to accomplish that you want to?
Well, I'm almost 84 years old, and my health is not too good. I've got some neuropathy in my feet and ankles, so I'm having a hard time getting around. But I don't know that I've got any great project that I'm working on. Read a good bit, and but the years have gone by and they've taken their toll, I can tell.
Well, you've left quite a legacy, but I failed to ask you about you being considered once for the United States Supreme Court.
I was, yeah.
When was that, and what happened?
Well, that was when Clinton was elected. He was elected in 1980. When was Clinton elected exactly? Remember?
I'm drawing a blank too, 1980.
Anyway, as soon as he was elected, Whizzer White, Byron White, on the Supreme Court, who'd been appointed by Kennedy, stepped down, resigned, and so there was a vacancy. And Clinton had a lot of confidence in a fellow who was the chief judge of the Eighth Circuit, and who was a very good friend of mine. At that time, I was chief judge of the Sixth. And so he called Richard Arnold. He wasn't going to appoint Arnold to begin with because of something in Arkansas, you know. Clinton had just been governor of Arkansas, and he should have appointed Arnold, who, however, didn't last too long. He died subsequently pretty quickly. But anyway, he asked Richard to advise him, and as I say, I also knew Clinton and Hillary a little bit because they came over to Nashville several times when he was governor of Arkansas. And so anyway, he asked Richard about judges, and to make a long story short, Richard recommended me to be appointed to the Supreme Court. And so for several weeks there, I had to send all this information in, and everything I had done, and send them information about my health and information about my estate and assets. I mean, they want to know everything you can think of. And so it kind of got out that I was being considered. And I went to Washington. I don't know, I can't remember whether it was for the purpose of talking to President Clinton, Bill Clinton. But anyway, I went over to the White House and I talked to Clinton, and he said to me after, and they'd considered me for several weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and I thought maybe I was going to be appointed. And he said, "You need to talk to Hillary," in a way that made me think, well, she is for somebody else or something. So Hillary was near at hand, but across the room, and I went over and said hello. And she was cold as a fish, and she had always been very pleasant. And so I knew something was wrong. But what had happened was that she wanted Clinton to appoint Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and in the end, that's what happened. She wanted another woman to be appointed on the Supreme Court, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a good appointment. So that's what happened.
No regrets?
Well, you know, I'm sure in some ways I would have preferred to be appointed, but in other ways not. My favorite Supreme Court justice in a way is John Paul Stevens. And he had a very distinguished career and stepped down at age 90. He's still living. I don't know. I mean, there are good things about it, and but a lot like Kennedy and others are happy to be leaving when they get to be old, you know. And it's not a job that works out very well once you get elderly. It's a hard job, you know.
Well, Gil, we mostly concentrated on the U.S. Attorney's job, and I know that you have given other histories and documentaries, and one is on the Tennessee Bar Foundation website, and I believe your son Eli is putting together a documentary,
Yes.
a lengthy documentary, and do you know when that will appear? And
Well, they've just finished that, and it's available from him. I can give you his telephone number, and he can tell you exactly how you get it off the internet or something. He's worked all that out, but he's got 2 hours of documentary about my life. Some of it as a lawyer and as a judge and so on. But I'll give you his.
well, I'll try to get that and add that as an appendix to your
Yeah.
oral history here today. I just want to say in closing that I've had the pleasure of knowing you and your family, your wonderful family, since
Yes.
my early years in life, and I admire them very much, and you've been very blessed with great people around you and a great family, and I commend you for all the good things you've done, and I thank you again for taking your time to give us your oral history.
Well, thank you. I know I don't even remember, it's been so many years ago the first time we met, but you were a young man at that time.
A young boy,
A
I'd
young
say.
boy, that's right. All right, well, I've enjoyed trying to remember things here and going back. I've been on the bench now for 43 years. So I can tell at my age, my memory is not quite as good as it used to be.
Well, we both had forgotten that Clinton was not elected in 1980.
Yeah.
That's a little early for him. Well, thank you so much, Gil.
All right, thank you.